These scary crimes have baffled police and private investigators for years, or even decades. Some may not have gotten the publicity they deserved, which might have prevented justice from being done at the time. Others shocked the nation, but the criminal or criminals still managed to get away with their crimes. Number 5. It was described as the most guarded room in America, but in July of 1979, it became the scene of one of the most audacious heists in New York history. Someone had stolen $600,000 from the Transit Authority, and they were never caught. The scene of the crime was 370 J Street in downtown Brooklyn. It earned the name the Transportation Building as headquarters for the New York City Transit Authority and lies right above one of the city's main subway lines. With millions of people using the transit system every day, the Transit Authority had a lot of cash on hand at any time. Throughout the day, it would be stored at various stations and depots, but every night it needed to be transported to the Transportation Building. At first, armored trucks were used, but this proved to be inefficient and left plenty of opportunities for would-be thieves, so designers used the subway line. The armored money trains would stop directly beneath the Transportation Building, having collected cash from all of the stations in the city. That money would then be transported by elevator up to the second floor and to the money room. Finally, at the end of the day, it was stored safely in the money vault. Access to the vault required 2 passcodes, with only one person in the organization knowing both halves of the code. The codes also changed regularly. On top of that, there were CCTV, alarms, and security guards monitoring the building. It was said that 370 J Street often had more money than most banks, and it wouldn't have been a hyperbole. But even with all the security, there were weaknesses in the vault, as 2 workers found out in late spring of 1979. The workers had found themselves locked in the secure money room. They removed a metal plate from the wall and broke through to the women's bathroom. It didn't take long for everybody in the building to learn of this embarrassing event. The hole was covered with plywood. At the time, there were very few women working in the building, and it didn't seem like a big issue that there was just a flimsy piece of wood between the highly secure money vault and the restroom. However, it would take more than a hole in the wall to pull off this strange robbery. In early July, a memo went out to employees at the building. Between 1 p.m. and 8 p.m. on Saturday, the 21st, the Transit Authority was going to be running a simulated blackout. None of the CCTV cameras of the 24 alarms around the building would be working. There would, however, be extra personnel guarding the building. 2 supervisors and 3 police officers would be assigned to the vault. They felt that would be enough to deter any would-be robber. At 6:05 p.m., the Friday before the blackout, 2 workers stored the money in the vault. The money was stacked according to size, with $600,000 in $10 bills stacked together. It would have weighed around 120 pounds and took up the same amount of space as an air conditioning unit. The next Monday, the same 2 workers returned to the vault to find the money gone. Nothing else had been disturbed. There was no sign of a break-in. None of the other piles of cash had been touched. At first, the head of security was reluctant to say that a crime had taken place. The man in charge was Sanford Gerlich, a World War II veteran, and a man described as a sweetheart. He wanted to combat crime in New York City subways. At the time, thefts and assaults on the subway were a really big problem. But when $600,000 of the Transit Authority's own money went missing, he didn't want to make a big deal of the crime, at least not publicly. Gerlich at first implied that the money might have been misplaced. A search of the building took place, just in case 120 pounds of $10 bills had been placed elsewhere. It hadn't. Eventually, the New York Police Department and the FBI were involved in the hunt for the missing cash. It was clear that whoever was behind the crime knew exactly what they were looking for. They hadn't bothered with any of the smaller bills and didn't even seem to have looked through the piles to find the money that they wanted. They had also apparently known about the hole in the wall. Given the fact that the news of the breakout from the money room had made its way around the building, that only limited the suspects to those that worked at 370 J Street. That was in no way a small number of people, but it was a start. Workers were fingerprinted and went through lie detector tests. There are reports that at least one of the workers failed a lie detector test, but that wouldn't necessarily mean they were behind the crime. It's not uncommon for these sorts of tests to provide false readings, especially if the person is incredibly nervous. The fingerprints didn't lead to any new clues as to what had happened. Even if authorities were certain that this was an inside job, figuring out how it was done wasn't simple. Getting from the women's restroom into the vault was one thing, but getting into the building shouldn't have been that easy. There were in-person guards located around the building. The thief or thieves would have had to know where the guards would be and how to avoid them. Getting the money out of the building wouldn't be easy either. Investigators believed that the criminals had someone on the outside who they could throw bags of money down to. These people would have had to go unnoticed by both security guards and passers-by. The crime would have taken place in downtown Brooklyn in the middle of the afternoon. It seemed impossible that nobody had seen the crime take place. Weeks later, the first real clue in the case came when empty money bags were discovered in a motel room in New Jersey. The bags were stamped with Transit Authority and Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It was a big clue, and authorities believed the culprits had come from New Jersey, but again, the case went cold. Investigators had a few suspects who were tailed for years after the crime, but no evidence could be found linking him to the robbery. Gerlich himself had his own theories about who was behind the theft, but didn't share any names as he didn't have any evidence. He passed away in 2011 with the case still unsolved. The Transit Authority heist remains one of the biggest in New York's history, and the one that received the least attention. Number 4. On the afternoon of January 3rd, 1990, the family of Akiko Kashiwagi returned home from a strawberry picking trip. They found Akiko's body in the kitchen. The secretive businessman had been attacked with a bladed object and left behind a strange unsolved case. Akiko Kashiwagi was somehow both famous and secretive. Very little is known about his early life or personal life. His business dealings made him vast sums of money, but exactly how much was never revealed. When one casino ran a credit check on him, they listed his occupation only as businessman. He was camera shy, but his presence at casinos attracted national newspapers. When someone took his life, the crime made headlines around the world. What we do know about Akiko is that he was born into a relatively poor family. His father was a carpenter who specialized in shrines and had to make enough to support 10 children. Akiko was the middle child. He dropped out of high school and started his working life on a farm. After that, he became a tour guide at Mount Fuji. In the 1960s, he had the money and the connections to start a business. He brought up real estate in the local area. Some accounts say that he started with just the equivalent of $600, but it was the beginning of a retail boom in the area. New roads had been built, and suddenly Akiko found himself in possession of land in a tourist hotspot. His real estate company also doubled as a money lending company, and it was here that a shadier side of Akiko's business dealings became apparent. He would happily lend money, but when it came time to pay it back, Akiko was nowhere to be seen. His debtors couldn't pay back their money on time. It would be through no fault of their own, but Akiko would take the opportunity to seize their property. On one occasion, this happened to the owner of a kindergarten. Akiko seized the kindergarten, evicted the children, and demolished it. An apartment building was then built on the site. When Akiko couldn't get what he wanted, he turned to some aggressive tactics. In one area of Tokyo, he purchased the homes of around 60 families. One family refused to sell. Akiko began a campaign of harassment. The family owned the first story of a building. Akiko demolished the second story from over their heads, and in the end, the family managed to get a restraining order against him. It's unsurprising that rumors suggested that Akiko had connections to organized crime. The Yakuza definitely had the power and influence to aid Akiko in his business ventures, and to help him harass those who didn't do what he wanted them to do. The evidence of any connection has never been uncovered, but it would explain aspects of this extremely secretive and mysterious man's life. Akiko claimed to earn $100 million a year and have $1 billion in assets. The official numbers from his business are a little murky, but most sources came to just a fraction of that. He was still a very wealthy man. His family drove a fleet of Western cars, and he had a purpose-built home described as Kashiwagi's castle. but it seemed like some, if not most of his money, didn't necessarily come from his real estate business. By 1990, Akiko had made a name for himself in casinos. His friends described him as a typical Japanese man, preferring samurai television programs, traditional architecture, and Japanese cars. The only Western thing he preferred was baccarat. Baccarat is a fast-paced card game similar to blackjack. One of the reasons why it may have been Akiko's favorite was because the house only had a slim advantage compared to any other card games. The chances of winning big at the baccarat table was better than anywhere else in the casino. Akiko bet big. He would bet hundreds of thousands of dollars per hand and play for hours. For someone who didn't like publicity, this was a risky move for Akiko. He wasn't only risking money, but also his privacy. In January of 1990, he made headlines when he won over $22 million playing his favorite game in an Australian casino. He became known among casino owners as a whale, and it attracted attention. He was invited to play at the Trump Taj Mahal. The event attracted a huge amount of media attention, and Akiko played for 2 days. The table he played at was specially roped off, but other gamblers could peer over marble walls to get a glimpse at Akiko and his huge pile of casino chips. It was likely extremely off-putting for a man who just a few weeks earlier had been insisting his photo wasn't taken at a boxing event. Akiko won $6 million in 10 hours before deciding that he had had enough. He was lured back with a deal a few months later. He was to keep playing either until he doubled the $12 million that he started with or lost it all. At first, Akiko was on a winning streak, but as time went on, he was down to $10 million. The casino stopped the game at that point, much to Akiko's frustration. He left with just $2 million and an anger towards the casino and its owner. It's likely that anger went both ways. Akiko had paid for his chips with a check, which the casino didn't try to cash until after he had left. They discovered that it either bounced or Akiko had canceled it. This wasn't an isolated incident. For such big gamblers, casinos will sometimes give a line of credit. Akiko owed casinos in the US, Europe, and Australia. Back in Japan, things weren't going great with his business, and it seemed like the property bubble that Akiko had been riding was about to burst. According to friends, Akiko had mellowed out in his later years. He no longer tried his more aggressive business tactics. In particular, he was concerned about his oldest son. His son had apparently gotten involved with the wrong crowds and would often steal art or jewels from his father's property to sell them. There was likely a lot going on in Akiko's mind when he had dinner with friends on the evening of January 3rd, 1992. But if he said anything concerning to any of them, it was never recorded. He returned to his highly secure home near Mount Fuji and settled to watch a samurai drama on TV. It was sometime after 8 p.m. that his family returned to find his body. The house was completely secure. There were no signs of a break-in. There was also no sign of a robbery. There were millions of dollars worth of artifacts around the house as well as cash, but none of it was taken. Instead, Akiko had simply been attacked and left in a disturbing state. Some sources claim he was attacked with a samurai sword. Not long after the crime, there was an arrest. A small-time gangster who may have been an acquaintance of Akiko's oldest son was arrested. But this man was in serious debt, so it was strange that he had chosen not to steal anything from the home. It also seems unlikely that Akiko would have welcomed him into his home, as police believe that was the case with the attacker. There was no evidence linking him to the crime, and he was released. Nobody has ever been charged with the crime. Some believe his possible ties to the Yakuza had cost him his life. He left behind millions of dollars in debt to casinos. It's possible they weren't the only people he owed money to, though. Others believe one of the casinos decided to make an example of him. More than 30 years later, nobody has claimed responsibility for the crime, and it's never been solved. In 2007, the statute of limitations in the case expired, meaning whoever committed this scary crime has managed to get away with it. Number 3. The Victor Penny case is one of the most baffling cases you might not have heard of, taking place in New Zealand in 1935. What at first seemed like a normal assault case turned into something from a science fiction book that has never truly been explained. Victor was born in the south of England at the beginning of the 20th century. He lived a relatively unremarkable life until his mid-30s. According to a newspaper article from 1937, he had an ordinary schooling and moved to New Zealand without any real skills or qualifications. After arriving, he took up a job in cabinet making and proved himself as a quick learner. He wouldn't stay in the job long though. Victor spent his time going from simple job to simple job. He was an attendant at a bus depot in Takapuna when the crime took place. As with many things surrounding the life of Victor Penny, what exactly happened is shrouded in secrecy. It was late on the night of June 29, 1985. Victor was working alone at the North Shore Transport Company's bus depot when he was attacked. Some reports at the time claimed that a weapon was used. Others say when he first regained consciousness, the first thing he said was, the papers, the War Office." Whatever had happened, the attack was severe enough for Victor to be taken to the hospital, and the mystery only grew. Police guarded Victor day and night, with visitors limited. Newspaper reporters visited the hospital trying to find out what had happened, and were met with sarcastic responses from the police. It seemed there was no appeal for information about the attack on an ordinary bus station attendant. Reporters quickly figured out that that was because this was no ordinary bus station attendant. Victor had always been interested in radios and experimented with them in his free time. In 1923, he had apparently stumbled across something extremely strange. While experimenting with circuits, he had changed some switches. A box of matches lying nearby suddenly burst into flames. He was able to repeat this experiment. Victor also felt a physical discomfort when conducting these experiments, and it was described as something like a black veil falling over his eyes. Before long, the experiments apparently attracted the attention of militaries, both foreign and domestic. He was approached by foreign powers who were interested in funding his experiments. Which foreign powers these were has never been revealed, but Victor denied them anyway. He was met with threatening messages. The New Zealand authorities then acted. Members of the Legion of Frontiersmen, as well as former Army and Navy officers, were recruited to guard Victor. Apparently, his attack took place on the only night when he wasn't being guarded. Victor remained in the hospital for about a week before he disappeared. He'd been taken to Somes Island, an island in Wellington Harbor. It had previously been used as a quarantine station and for holding Germans and prisoners of war during the First World War. Now it was used for Victor's experiments. Descriptions about Victor's time on Somes Island make it hard to determine if he was a prisoner or not. His sleeping quarters were apparently surrounded by barbed wire and were floodlit. But he was allowed flares, weapons, and a laboratory with all the equipment he could need. A detachment of soldiers guarded him day and night, and he wasn't allowed any visitors. Eventually, his wife was allowed to join him on the island, but couldn't stay in the same sleeping quarters as him. He would have to visit her at the caretaker's lodge where she lived. The guards would always join them. Unsurprisingly, no details of what exactly Victor's experiments on the island were have been revealed. The newspaper article from 1937 does have some details about experiments conducted before this mysterious trip, though. Apparently, Victor was trying to figure out what had caused some spontaneous combustions at the Cowrie gum stores. He found that the energy ray that he'd created could combust more than just boxes of matches. He also discovered that no amount of insulating material could stop this ray. But he didn't really have any control over the ray. These details led to theories that Victor was working on weaponizing whatever he had discovered. On March 23, 1936, local papers published a statement about the Minister of Defense and the Minister in charge of policing, stating that the experiments had come to an end and there was no evidence that his alleged discoveries were authentic. There had been a change in government at the end of 1935, which may have triggered the change in interest in Victor's experiments. 2 years later, future Prime Minister Peter Fraser told Parliament that the government had found Victor under guard and searching for a mythical death ray at the cost of $1,000. He claimed it was obvious there was no genius invention, which was why the government had put a stop to the experiments. According to a journalist who spoke with Victor in 1937, the only thing that had been holding the experiments back was finances. Whatever the case, Victor returned to his home in Auckland and continued to live a quiet life. Almost 90 years on, very little about the case has ever been confirmed, given the fact that no such ray has been invented since, and nobody has replicated Victor's initial experiments. It seems likely that whatever happened with the matches wasn't caused by mysterious radio waves. But at a time when our understanding of waves and particles was rapidly changing, it wouldn't be strange for governments to take interest in these experiments. Victor was a gifted radio operator who consulted the Auckland broadcasting stations and ran his own amateur radio station after his experiments. It wouldn't have seemed impossible that the next scientific breakthrough was just around the corner. But the man who had assaulted Victor at the bus depot in June of 1935 has never been revealed. He may have been working for a foreign power. Years later, a strange story from one of the guards seems to boost this theory. The guard was William Porter. Porter claimed to have seen Victor's early experiments in action and was amazed by them. He also claimed that someone had fired at him while he was on duty. Shortly before this attack, he'd been approached by a man claiming to be from the Secret Service, who told Porter that he would be taking over guarding that night. Porter stood his ground, which may have triggered the attempt on his life. Alternatively, it may have been a thief or a trespasser attacking a porter at a bus depot. The secrecy surrounding the case means the truth will likely never be known. Number 2. On March 23, 1988, Deborah Lindsley said goodbye to her family and caught a train to London on her way home to Edinburgh. She wouldn't leave the train alive. To this day, the vicious attack against this young woman remains a puzzling, unsolved crime. Deborah was 26 years old in 1988. She was a fashionable young woman who'd been brought up in the suburbs of London. A few months before this disturbing crime, she had relocated to Edinburgh for a job as a trainee hotel manager. It was a big step, but Deborah was in a good place in her life. The previous weekend, Deborah had traveled back down to Bromley, where her parents lived. There was a hotel management conference in London that she was attending, but she'd also come to take part in the last-minute preparations for her brother's wedding, which was taking place in 2 weeks' time. Deborah initially planned to travel back to Edinburgh in the late afternoon, but during the conference, she'd gotten in touch with the manager of the Sherlock Holmes Hotel in London. The opportunity to work close to the rest of her family was one that she didn't want to pass up. Her plans changed, and Deborah caught an earlier train to London so she could meet up with this manager before getting on the long train back to Edinburgh. Her brother Gordon drove Deborah to Petts Wood train station. At the station, she purchased her ticket and a pack of cigarettes, then boarded the train at 2:16 p.m. At the time, the train was a mixture of different carriages. Most of the carriages were similar to those we see today, with a long corridor down the center of the carriage and rows of seats on either side. But a few of the carriages were still an old-fashioned compartment kind. Each compartment could seat 6 people, and the only way to travel between compartments would be to get off at a station and re-enter the train elsewhere. By the late 1980s, these carriages were being phased out of British trains, and the danger of riding in one was well known. They could be very isolating, especially during off-peak hours, and if something happened in one compartment, there would be no way to escape between stops. Deborah knew the dangers of these carriages. Her parents described her as being very safety cautious, but she still decided to sit in one of these isolated compartment-style carriages for her trip to London. It may be because this was the only smoking carriage on the train, or because there were other women in the compartment where Deborah boarded. The journey to London Victoria Station took little over half an hour. It was a stopping service with 10 stops between Petts Wood and London Victoria. The longest gap between the stops was between Brixton and Victoria, with a total of 8 minutes between the stations. It wasn't until after the train left Brixton that anybody noticed anything unusual. The carriage Deborah was seated in contained 2 compartments, though it still wasn't possible to move between the 2 without leaving the train. In the other compartment was an 18-year-old Frenchwoman named Helene Josseline. Just after the train left Brixton, Helene heard a woman screaming in the other compartment. She described them as screams of fear, and they were very loud. They continued for a total of 2 minutes, at which time Helene was frozen in her seat. There was an alarm in the compartment, but she was too scared to use it. By the time the train arrived at Victoria, the screams had gone silent. A train porter named Ron Lacey boarded the train at 2:50 p.m. to check for luggage or lost items left behind. He found Deborah's lifeless body in her compartment. It was clear there had been a frenzied attack inside, with red stains across the compartment seats and floor. Deborah had been struck with a bladed weapon 11 times. Police were able to determine that Deborah had managed to wound her attacker during the fight, and DNA from this attacker was collected. The weapon was never found, but police believed it had been a high-quality kitchen utensil. The person who had committed the scary crime had left their home with the intention of taking someone's life. Authorities were alerted, and the search for this disturbing criminal began. Deborah's family and boyfriend have both been cleared by investigators. Looking through the people Deborah knew, the police couldn't find anyone who would want to hurt the young woman. It seemed the most likely culprit was a complete stranger. Like today, London Victoria was an extremely busy train station. About 70 people are believed to have traveled on the 216, but only between 30 and 40 were still aboard when it pulled into Platform 2 at Victoria. Those passengers would have quickly been lost in the crowds of people rushing for trains or making their way out of the station. It's likely the criminal would have had stains on his clothing when he left the train, but nobody reported anybody who looked like they'd just taken a life. When the scary crime made headlines, a number of people came forward with tips about strange people they saw at the station that day. There were tips about 2 different men who were seen with wounds on their faces. This would normally be suspicious, but the attack on Deborah wasn't the only violence that had taken place that day. At Wembley Stadium, there was a football match between England and the Netherlands, and some scuffles had taken place. It's possible that those wounded men had simply been in one of these fights and had nothing to do with the attack on Deborah. Helene had also seen someone strange at the station. She spotted a man limping away from Deborah's carriage, though she didn't know for certain if he had been in the carriage or simply walking past it. He was described as being between 40 and 50 years old, well-built, with red hair and a mustache. Helene tried to follow him, but lost him in the crowd. Unfortunately, she only came forward with this information after a police appeal, rather than on the day of the crime itself. A sketch of the man was released, but he was never identified. Another strange man had been spotted earlier in the journey. At Penge East Station, 5 stops before Victoria, a man had exited the train before getting back on near the front, around the same area where Deborah's carriage was located. He was described as being scruffy-looking, about 30 years old. He was stocky, with dirty blonde hair and wearing a brown jacket. He too has never been identified. Of the 70 or so people who took the train that afternoon, 20 have come forward. Even if they didn't see or hear anything related to the crime, police have still asked for those people to speak to them. Police still have the criminal's DNA on record, but there's never been a match in any national database. They believe this wasn't the first time the criminal had done something like this, and it may not have been the last. It's possible this is a case that will eventually be solved with genetic genealogy. But the police and Deborah's friends are still appealing for anybody with information to come forward. In 2013, a $20,000 reward was announced for information that would catch the criminal. Anybody with information on this crime can contact the Met Police at 0207-230-4294 or Crime Stoppers at 0800-555-111. Number 1. Shortly before midnight on December 20th, 2004, a woman alerted authorities to a robbery at the Northern Bank in Belfast. For more than 24 hours, she and her family had been held hostage while a group of criminals forced her husband and one of his co-workers to go through with the crime. 19 years later, the Northern Bank robbery remains unsolved. The ordeal began at about 10 p.m. on the day before. Masked men forced their way into the home of 23-year-old Chris Ward. The rest of Chris's family were held hostage, while Chris was driven up to the home of his supervisor, Kevin McMullen. Members of the gang had already forced their way into Kevin's home, pretending to be police officers before tying up Kevin and his wife. Chris and Kevin were both key holders at the Northern Bank, the biggest retail bank in Northern Ireland. They worked at the bank's headquarters in Belfast. The bank was permitted to print its own banknotes, and millions of pounds worth of notes would be held at the headquarters. The gang wanted that money, but they weren't going to break into the bank themselves. Instead, they instructed the 2 men to get the cash for them while they held their loved ones hostage. Chris had already been separated from his family. Now Kevin's wife, Karen, was moved from the home and taken to another location. She was blindfolded and had tape over her mouth. She later said that she feared she would lose her life that night. After a terrifying night, the two bank employees went to work and tried to act normal. They knew the gang wasn't messing around, and if anybody figured out that something was wrong, they wouldn't see their families again. They told the other staff to go home early, which didn't seem to ring any alarm bells. The bank was still open and operating, but when they weren't serving customers, they were filling a holdall with millions of pounds in large notes. At about 6 p.m., Chris was captured on CCTV leaving the bank with the holdall. He had been instructed to take the cash around the corner and hand it over to one of the gang members. Police later claimed this was simply a dummy run. They would be coming back for more later. Even though the rest of the day staff had gone home, there was still security at the bank. The gang had instructed employees to put cash in crates, which would be transported in a box van. But getting those past the security guards without alerting them wasn't simple. The boxes were disguised as trash and taken down on trolleys to the loading bay. At one point, a security guard came over to chat with Kevin while he waited, but Kevin managed to get him to leave before the van arrived. The white van made 2 trips to collect crates before leaving the scene. Roadside CCTV cameras later spotted the van traveling south near a retail center in Lisburn. Chris and Kevin returned to the Ward family home after the job was completed. The gang hadn't hurt Chris's family but had terrified them. The house was wiped of any trace of their presence. The criminals took any cups that they drank from with them. Meanwhile, Karen was released. She managed to make it to a house where she alerted authorities to what had happened. By that point, all the criminals were long gone, and the police were left with a disturbing puzzle to try to piece together. A total of £26.5 million was stolen. Most of that was in the form of uncirculated Northern banknotes, but $8.8 million was in used sterling notes, and another $1 million was in other currencies such as dollars and euros. Within days, 50 police officers were put on the case. It was clear these were very competent criminals, and it didn't take long for suspicion to fall on the Provisional IRA. Northern Ireland was in a turbulent place politically, and the suspicion didn't help. There was a lot of pressure on police to crack the crime. The bank itself acted quickly. Northern banknotes were withdrawn from circulation and replaced with notes of a different color. It meant that the vast majority of the money stolen during the heist was now worthless. A little over a month after this was announced, a man in Passage West, County Cork, spotted something unusual falling from the sky. One of his neighbors was having a bonfire, which wasn't too unusual, but some of the blackened material he was using had been blown into the man's garden. It wasn't paper or leaves that the so-called bonfire man had set alight, but money. The incident was reported to the police, who arrived to find millions in damaged notes. It was one of several raids that took place in the Republic of Ireland around that time. One of those who was raided was a financial advisor named Ted Cunningham. £3 million and 200 euros were seized from his home in County Cork. He was later charged with money laundering, which he denied. A number of arrests were made over the years. Most of those were never charged with anything. There was little in the way of evidence unless actual cash was found. Even though CCTV of the box van was released to the public, it was little help in tracking down the actual thieves. Of the people who were actually involved in the robbery itself, only one person stood trial, and that was Chris Ward himself. Police believed that there had been an inside man for the crime, and one that hadn't been forced to take part. There was some confusion about Chris's work on the day of the heist, which allegedly raised suspicions. Others thought that Chris had been targeted due to the fact that he was a Catholic. The case against Chris went to court but soon fell apart, and he was found not guilty. Nobody has ever been found guilty of taking 2 families hostage and forcing 2 innocent men into a terrifying situation. The crime not only risked the lives of the McMullen and Ward families, but did so for very little financial gain in the end. It remains one of the biggest unsolved crimes in UK history. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.